Xin chào các bạn. Trong video này mình sẽ học thuộc bài đoạn văn. Cái đoạn văn có tên là Day of the Dead và sau đấy mình sẽ phản xạ cùng với thầy AJ Ho. Tức là thầy sẽ hỏi và mình sẽ trả lời các câu hỏi liên quan đến về cái đoạn văn này và mình sẽ học thuộc trước nhé. Học thuộc trước thì mình sẽ đọc trước. Rồi, here we go. Day of the Dead. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I'm curious about this holiday, so I go to the cemetery to see what's happening. What I find is quite interesting. The atmosphere is like a party. There are people everywhere. Families are sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. They clean the graves and ate fresh flowers. I walk through the cemetery and admire the beauty of all the colorful flowers. There is also color in the sky because many kids are flying kites. Some families are having a picnic next to the graves. They eat, drink, and chat together. People laugh and smile. In the United States, cemeteries are always sampled. We certainly never have festivals or parties next to graves. We don't laugh or play music or fly kites in cemeteries either. I find that I prefer the Guatemala approach. I like the way they remember and celebrate those who have passed away. I like that they acknowledge that instead of denying it the way Americans do. I like that there is life as well as death in their cemeteries. Guatemalans call it the Day of the Dead. It is also a day of appreciate life. Rồi, mình có thể dịch cái đoạn văn này một chút nhé. Thì ngày của người chết và tôi đến Guatemala vào ngày lễ ngày của người chết vào mùng 1 tháng 11. Và tôi rất là tò mò về cái ngày lễ này, bởi vậy tôi đã đến nghĩa trang và tôi đến nghĩa trang để xem cái chuyện gì nó đang xảy ra. Những cái điều mà tôi thấy thì rất là thú vị. Không khí thì giống như một bữa tiệc, có rất là nhiều người ở mọi nơi này. Các gia đình thì đang ngồi xung quanh các ngôi mộ, họ lau chùi cái ngôi mộ và thêm hoa tươi vào. Tôi thì đi bộ xung quanh cái nghĩa trang và ngắm nhìn cái vẻ đẹp muôn loài của các loài hoa. Cũng có nhiều màu sắc ở trên bầu trời bởi vì là bọn trẻ đang thả diều và một vài gia đình thì đang có các bữa tiệc, đang có cái cuộc dã ngoại ở xung quanh cái ngôi mộ. Ngôi mộ này họ ăn này, uống này, rồi trò chuyện và vui vẻ với nhau. Nhưng mà ở Mỹ thì là các ngôi mộ thì thường là u ám và chúng tôi chắc chắn là không bao giờ có các lễ hội hay là các bữa tiệc xung quanh cái ngôi mộ. Và chúng tôi không cười này, chúng tôi cũng không cười, không có chơi nhạc, nghe nhạc và cũng không có thả diều. Và tôi thấy rằng là tôi thích cái người mà người Guatemala thừa nhận cái chết. Tôi thích cái cách mà họ tưởng nhớ và kỷ niệm người chết. Người chết thay vì phủ nhận cái chết thì họ dám thừa nhận này. Và I like that, thừa nhận cái chết. Và tôi thích cái cách này hơn là cái này hơn của người Guatemala hơn là người Mỹ vẫn thường làm. Và ở nghĩa trang thì có như kiểu là có cả sự sống và cái chết, cũng như là họ thừa nhận, họ chấp nhận cái sống cũng như là cái chết. Và người Guatemalan gọi cái ngày đấy là ngày của người chết, nhưng mà nó cũng là cái ngày đề cao sự sống. Rồi bắt đầu mình sẽ phản xạ cái bài này nhá. Rồi câu đầu tiên.
I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
Rồi, I arrived in Guatemala on the day of the dead, November 1st. Tôi đến cái Guatemala vào cái ngày của người chết vào mùng 1 tháng 11. Đấy.
Did I arrive in Guatemala?
Yes, I did. I arrived in Guatemala.
Yes, I arrived in Guatemala. Where did I arrive?
Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the day of the dead, November 1st.
Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Who arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead?
Me. Yes, me. AJ. I arrived in Guatemala on the day of the dead.
Well, me, AJ, right? I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd?
No. I didn't arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd. I arrived in Guatemala on the November 1st.
No, I didn't arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. What day did I arrive in Guatemala?
November 1st. November 1st, yeah. I arrived in Guatemala on the day of the dead, November 1st.
November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. Where did I arrive on November 1st?
Guatemala. Yeah, Guatemala. I arrived on November. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st.
Well, Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Was I angry about this holiday?
No. I wasn't angry about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday.
No, I wasn't angry about this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
No. I wasn't. I wasn't sad about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday.
No, I wasn't sad about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday. Who was curious about this holiday?
Well, me, AJ. I was curious about this holiday.
Well, I was, AJ. I was curious about this holiday. What was I curious about?
I was curious about this holiday, the Day of the Dead.
The holiday, right? I was curious about the holiday. Which holiday was I curious about?
The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the holiday, and I was curious about the Day of the Dead.
Which holiday was I curious about? The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. Was I curious about the Day of the Dead? Or was I curious about Christmas?
I was curious about the Day of the Dead, not Christmas.
Well, I was curious about the Day of the Dead, of course. I was curious about the Day of the Dead, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where did I go?
I went to the cemetery. Yeah, cemetery.
To the cemetery. I went to the cemetery. Did I go to the cemetery or did I go to the airport?
To the cemetery, of course. I went to the cemetery, not the airport.
Easy. I went to the cemetery. Who went to the cemetery?
Well, me, AJ. I went to the cemetery.
Well, me, right? AJ. Right? I went to the cemetery.
Có phải chúng ta học mãi mà không thể nói được những câu tiếng Anh đơn giản như thế này không các bạn? Trong cái mục đố bài
Where did I go?
I went to the cemetery.
To the cemetery. Right. I went to the cemetery. When did I go to the cemetery?
I went to the cemetery November 1st, the Day of the Dead.
Oh, November 1st, the Day of the Dead. Right? I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead,
November 1st.
November 1st.
First.
Why did I go to the cemetery?
I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Well, to see what was happening. I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening?
Well, me, AJ. I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Me, AJ, went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where was the cemetery?
The cemetery was Guatemala. Yeah, Guatemala. The cemetery was Guatemala.
In Guatemala. Right? The cemetery was in Guatemala. What is the Day of the Dead?
The Day of the Dead is is holiday. Holiday. Yeah, holiday.
A holiday. Right? The Day of the Dead is a holiday. When is the Day of the Dead?
November 1st. Yeah, November 1st. The Day of the Dead is on November 1st.
November 1st. The Day of the Dead was and is November 1st.
So I went to cemetery on the day.
So
of
I
the
went
dead
to the
see
cemetery
what were happening.
on the Day of the Dead to see what was happening. What I found
What I found
was quite
was quite
interesting.
interesting. Interesting.
Was it boring?
No, it wasn't. Wasn't boring.
No, it wasn't boring. Was it interesting?
Yes, of course, it was interesting.
Yes, it was interesting. The cemetery was interesting. How did I feel about the cemetery?
Well, I felt interesting. I felt quite interesting.
I felt it was interesting. Or I thought it was interesting.
Interesting.
Was it boring or was it interesting?
Well, it was interesting.
It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting.
It was interesting.
What was interesting?
What I found. What I found was quite interesting.
The cemetery. The cemetery was interesting.
Interesting.
When was the cemetery interesting?
November 1st, the Day of the Dead. The cemetery was interesting on November 1st.
It was interesting on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Okay, the atmosphere
in the cemetery was
like a party.
Like a party.
Was the atmosphere very sad?
No. It wasn't. The atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party.
No, the atmosphere was not sad. The atmosphere was like a party. The atmosphere was very happy. Was the atmosphere sad or happy?
Of course, happy. The atmosphere were happy. The atmosphere was like a party.
The atmosphere was happy. The atmosphere was like a party. What was like a party?
The atmosphere, the atmosphere was like a party.
The atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party. Where was the atmosphere like a party?
In the cemetery. The atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party.
In the cemetery, right? The cemetery. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. Was the atmosphere like a party at my house?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't the atmosphere. No, it wasn't. The atmosphere wasn't like a party at my house.
No, not at my house. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery.
The atmosphere was
not like a party
so the
in my house.
Was like
So the atmosphere was like a party. There were people everywhere.
Families were sitting around the
graves of their dead ancestors. Where were the families sitting?
Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors.
Around the graves, right? They were sitting around the graves. Who was sitting around the graves?
Families were sitting around the graves.
The families, right? The families were sitting around the graves. Were they sitting around the trees?
No, they wasn't. They were not. They were not sitting around the trees. They were sitting around the graves.
No, they weren't sitting around the trees. They were sitting around the graves. So, where were they sitting?
They were sitting around the graves.
Around the graves.
Families were sitting around the graves.
Families were
of their
sitting
dead
around the
ancestors.
graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors?
Yes, they were. Yes, they were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors.
Yes, they were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their friends?
No, they wasn't. They wasn't sitting around the graves of their friends. They sitting around the graves of their ancestors.
No, not really.
No, not really.
They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors.
Ancestors.
Who was sitting around the graves? That's right.
Families were sitting around.
Families were sitting around the graves. Whose graves were they sitting around?
The graves of their dead ancestors.
Whose graves were they sitting around? Yes, their dead ancestors. Their ancestors. Their ancestors' graves.
They were sitting around.
They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors.
Ancestors.
Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors or the graves of their friends?
Of course, the graves of their dead ancestors. Yeah, they were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors, not the graves of their friends.
Ancestors, right? They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors.
Ancestors.
They cleaned the graves and added fresh flowers.
Added fresh flowers.
Who cleaned the graves?
That's right. The families. Families clean the graves.
That's right, the families. What did they add?
Fresh flowers. They added fresh flowers.
They added fresh flowers.
Mùa lễ hội uống Top Kit. Quay số trúng hoa xịn. Nhập mã in trên thẻ để quay số trúng hoa xịn với hai.
Did they add food?
No, they didn't. They added fresh flowers.
No, they didn't add food. Did they add money?
No, of course not. They added fresh flowers.
No, they didn't add money. They added fresh flowers. What did they clean?
The graves. They cleaned the graves.
They cleaned the graves. Whose graves did they clean?
The graves of their dead ancestors.
Their ancestors, right? They cleaned their ancestors' graves.
Their ancestor graves.
Where did they add flowers?
In the cemetery. Yeah. In Guatemala.
Where? Well, they added flowers to the graves.
Ah, sorry. They added
That's right.
flowers
They
to
cleaned the
graves.
graves
That's right.
and added fresh
They
flowers.
cleaned the graves and added fresh
Good.
flowers.
I walked through the cemetery and admired the beauty
The beauty
of all the colorful flowers. Where did I walk?
The cemetery. I walked through the cemetery.
Through the cemetery. I walked through the cemetery. Did I walk through the park?
No, I didn't. I walked. I walked through the park.
No, I didn't walk through the park. I walked through the cemetery.
The cemetery.
Where did I walk?
I walked through the cemetery. Across the
Through the
cemetery.
cemetery. Who walked through the cemetery?
Me, of course, me, AJ. I walked through the cemetery.
I did, AJ. I walked through the cemetery. Did I walk through the cemetery or did I walk through the park?
Of course, the cemetery. I walked through the cemetery, not through the park.
I walked through the cemetery. That's right. And I admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers.
Good.
Did I admire the beauty of the trees?
No, I didn't. I didn't admire the beauty of the trees. I admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers.
No, I didn't admire the beauty of the trees. Did I admire the beauty of the children?
No, I didn't. I didn't admire the beauty of the children.
No, I didn't admire the beauty of the children. What did I admire?
I admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers.
The flowers, right? Yeah, I admired
Yeah,
the beauty
I admired
of all the colorful flowers.
Yeah.
Who admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers?
Me, AJ, I admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers.
That's right. AJ,
That's right,
me,
AJ, me
admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Where were the flowers?
In the cemetery. Yeah, in the flowers were in the cemetery.
Yeah. On the graves.
On the graves in the cemetery.
In the cemetery.
Flowers were on the graves.
The flowers
in the
were
cemetery.
on the graves in the cemetery. Were the flowers in the park?
No, were not. The flowers in the cemetery.
No, they weren't in the park. Were the flowers in my house?
No, the flowers in the flowers were not in my house.
No, they weren't in my house. Where were the flowers?
The flowers was on the graves in the cemetery.
Oh, the flowers were on the graves in the cemetery.
Yeah.
Where did I walk?
I walked through the cemetery.
I walked through the cemetery. When did I walk through the cemetery?
November November 1st, the Day of the Dead. I walked through the cemetery.
November 1st, the Day of the Dead. Right? November 1st, the Day of the Dead, I walked through the cemetery. What was the cemetery like?
The cemetery was like party, right?
Like a party. It was like a party.
Party.
The cemetery was like a party.
Like party.
Was I curious about this holiday?
Yes, of course. I was curious about this holiday.
Yes, I was curious about this holiday. Which holiday was I curious about?
The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead.
Yeah, the Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. So I walked through the cemetery. There was also color in the sky because many kids were flying kites.
Ok, ngày mai mình sẽ làm tiếp cái video tiếp theo. Bây giờ mình sẽ đến đoạn này thôi. Thank you for watching. Bye bye. See you next video.